Hello and welcome. This is a global collaboration of societies of evidence-based policing, and we hope to bring you more in the future. We bring police leaders together from 5 countries. The topic, reducing family harm in the context of COVID-19.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first global collaboration of societies of evidence-based policing. We're coming to you at a very peculiar and difficult time. I'm speaking from Scotland Yard. My name is Alex Murray and I'm chair of the Society of Evidence-Based Policing in the UK. Right opposite me is Westminster Bridge, which currently is filled with emergency vehicles clapping and celebrating the NHS here in England and Wales. And around the world, our thoughts and prayers and feelings go out to all of those people who have suffered and lost ones as a result of coronavirus. In particular, we think of those people suffering from domestic abuse and their families at the moment. And the whole mission and purpose for this is to improve the response of policing to domestic abuse. So thank you for joining us. Thank you in particular for the speakers for joining us. Thank you to Simon Williams and the team at the Centre for Evidence-Based Policing in New Zealand for making this happen. And thank you to the KPMG team in Victoria for also supporting this effort. I'm just going to quickly introduce the different societies of evidence-based policing and give them a few seconds to say what they do. In the UK, the Society of Evidence-Based Policing is made up of researchers, practitioners, police officers who are keen to use, communicate and produce the best research evidence possible to try and make a difference. And I think that's the same for most societies of evidence-based policing around the world. But first, can I come to you, please? Dave Cowan of the Victoria Police and President of the Australia and New Zealand Society of Evidence-Based Policing.
The Australia and New Zealand Society of Evidence-Based Policing is made up of police from every state and Commonwealth jurisdiction in this country, along with New Zealand police and leading academics. We have a shared purpose, including the use of the best evidence to guide policing practice and the collaboration across policing and academia. But put simply, we're about making a difference through the use of evidence and science. That's what professions do. They use evidence. So in the context of COVID-19 and family harm, we consider what's emerging in our jurisdictions, what insights can we draw from that, and how might the best evidence help us respond. Coming together like this hasn't been done before, let alone so quickly. That's why this is such an important discussion to have.
Thanks. Can I come to you, please, Renee, from the States?
Hi, thanks for having me. And I'm really excited that we are all getting together across 5 different countries to talk about the evidence base and what we can do as far as family harm and other issues as we go on in this series. And I know some people have talked about, this is a pandemic. We've never seen it before, so how could there be an evidence base? But I think in policing, what we're doing is a lot like medicine, where you're taking what we know works and trying to apply it to what's occurring in the world. So I think today and these next series are going to be very interesting and exciting, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thanks very much, Renee. Dan, Canada.
Thank you very much for having me here. I come as a part of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police Research Advisory Committee. And that committee was established actually to do exactly what Society of Evidence-Based Policing across the world are established to do, is bring evidence-based practices into policing in Canada. In Canada, like the United States, we have very, very many different police agencies, municipal, and then we also have our federal RCMP. So I think this is super exciting to see police pivot in a time that needs pivoting on a topic that is emotional and also can be egregious harm. So I'm just excited to have everyone here to look at how we can apply existing evidence to an unprecedented time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Simon, can I come finally to you?
Good morning, Al. Good morning, everybody. Kia ora from New Zealand. It's about 7 o'clock here. Beautiful sunrise coming out over Mount Victoria. And I'd just like to say thank you to my team here in New Zealand and Natasha Allen, who's our family violence lead, for taking the time to pull the document together that accompanies this podcast and topic on family harm. And thank you to all of you for coming together as well. It's been a real team effort. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and thanks to your team for being real leaders in this global collaboration. So I'm now going to introduce our main discussants today. Firstly, Dean McWhirter is Assistant Commissioner of the Family Violence Command in Victoria Police. Dean, you are very welcome. Natasha Allen, Inspector of New Zealand Police, currently acting Superintendent with a national lead for family violence and safer Wanu families within the National Prevention Centre. Louisa Rolfe is the Deputy Chief Constable of West Midlands Police, but has national responsibility for England and Wales for domestic abuse. Anthony Morgan from the Australian Institute of Criminology. He's the current research manager at the Serious and Organised Crime Research Lab. Renee, you've heard from the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. She's a former police officer with the Sacramento Police Department, California, and the founder member of the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. And finally, Dan Jones from the Research Advisory Committee of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. Dan is currently a police inspector with Edmonton Police, and he has the responsibility for research and community relations. You are all really welcome, and thanks for coming. The first question I'm going to ask the discussants is, what are the most important recent developments you've seen during this COVID era around domestic abuse and family harm? Dean, really interested in your view.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everyone. I suppose the most interesting thing that we've probably identified at this particular point in time across the whole country, and I can say that with some knowledge, is that there is no statistically significant increase in any state or territory in terms of the reporting of family violence at this particular point in time in relation to what's going on in terms of all the restrictions that we're all facing. What we are seeing, though, is that the issues of unemployment of our perpetrators and also mental health of our perpetrators is becoming increasingly identified in the reports that we're taking for family violence. And probably not unsurprisingly, first-time reporting of incidents between parties in relation to intimate partner situations is that that's increasing quite significantly, whereas circumstances of incidents of family violence between previous relationships, and you have to understand in the Victorian context, our family violence response relates to all family violence contexts, not just intimate partner. So we've got quite a breadth of family violence to actually respond to. So the reports of former intimate partner offending is actually down, but first time reporting is up. And that would be, we would assume, because of when people are confined, they're restricted in terms of their movement, and they are now actually together so much more. These stresses are obviously coming out and coming to the forefront in terms of why we're seeing the reports. Sex offences is actually remaining pretty stable. No statistical significant increase for us in terms of the reporting of sexual offences for the same period last year. And interestingly enough, over 5 of the last 6 weeks in Victoria, we've had a 20% reduction week in, week out in relation to the crime associated with family violence, so which is quite interesting. But I think the biggest issue for us has actually been the change in everything around the frontline members. So whilst they're responding as business as usual, nothing's really changed for them in terms of, other than their own concerns about risk to themselves, everything else around them has changed. And I think that's the most interesting thing for policing. All the sector of the service response, the system response around, they've all changed their practice, but expected Victoria Police to maintain their practice. So courts have decided that they're not going to see anybody in the court environment. So AFMs, or affected family members in our case, or victims and perpetrators, you're no longer required to come to court. They've actually changed and pushed back all our court dates, so back to 3 months. Everything's going to be delayed. What is the downstream impact on policing in relation to all of these changes? Our service sector, all our specialist family violence services are no longer doing face-to-face engagement. So that has an impact on policing, because they change their model but don't consider what policing has to do, and they're expecting us to pick up a lot of the gaps that they're now creating because of their lack of engagement. Things like Department of Education telling their teachers, oh, don't worry about the normal arrangements, because if you have child welfare issues, because children are at home now who might be concerned about what's happening to them, report directly to police so we can do welfare checks. Well, that's not the normal process. It's not the normal practice. And that's occurred because the service sector that's supposed to be doing those welfare checks have decided not to do face-to-face engagement.
Thanks. That's really interesting. And as we go around the world, it'd be fascinating to see if there's any similarities or difference. And Natasha, can I come to you from New Zealand, please?
We've actually seen that, and initially when we went into level 4, we had a rise. So the first weekend when we went into lockdown, we saw a spike in our family harm. And again, family harm for us is also not just intimate partner violence, it's harm for all whānau. So whānau is the Māori word for families. So it's stabilised now though, so we've been keeping records in it. We've been in lockdown for 5 5 odd weeks now, and we've seen it stabilise. Slightly a little, maybe some weeks are a bit higher, but we've seen the trend of weekends it goes up and peaks, and during midweek it comes down. So that's what we've seen. We don't think that reflects probably what's happening out there. There's real concern amongst the sector and from our teams out on the ground that people are not in a position to report or seek help. Experience in New Zealand has shown that family violence, sexual violence and child abuse can all increase after a large-scale disaster. So, for example, after the Christchurch earthquakes, we saw a 53% increase in family violence in the year after the earthquakes. So, we potentially could be looking at an increase, but no one just knows. Some of the great things that have happened here over the last few weeks is we have seen incredible cross-agency partnerships, both government and the NGO sector. Of concern is we've seen a decrease in reports of child abuse and reports of concern to our lead care and protection agency, Oranga Tamariki. Obviously, the third-party reporting channel has disappeared for some of these children, so that's of concern to us. Also, we've seen a decrease in sexual violence. We have interviews of adult sexual assault and child protection crimes have actually been put on hold unless it's an urgent case. So we're going to be in a similar situation that we could find ourselves with a backlog of those to be conducted, and a bottleneck going forward. So that's sort of what we've seen here. We've seen an increase in parent-child calls for service, and obviously that's just parents having their children at home 24/7 has obviously had a huge impact. The decrease in calls for service has meant that a lot of our districts and areas who have a significant, and in particular counties Manukau in Auckland City, their volumes are significant. Normally they would have for example, on a Monday morning, they might have a backlog of 40 plus priority 2 family harm episodes to attend. Because our staff aren't attending other crime types at the moment and we've actually been able to keep on top of that, which has been significant. The response times have been great. So I think that we're going to see that will obviously disappear when we come out of lockdown. So with courts, they've been working remotely for our family violence cases, family harm, they have been still going through, but obviously working differently. So, and we've been working very, very closely with Justice on that and in respect of protection orders. So honestly, the collaboration across the country and with government and NGOs has been brilliant, I have to say.
Thanks. So fascinating then. Quite a lot of similarities with Victoria from a crime rate point of view, but a very different partnership approach. Louisa, can I come to you representing England and Wales and the phenomenon you've noticed?
Hi, hello everyone. In terms of reports, since we've been in lockdown measures here, we've not seen a statistically significant increase in reports of domestic abuse to police. In contrast, there are a number of national helplines run by the larger charities here, and they are reporting significant increases in calls for help. We're trying to work with them at the moment to get behind the sort of nature of those calls and whether there's a change to the threat in terms of the calls they're receiving. At the moment, we're still working with them on understanding that, but what we're hearing a little bit about is that some of the increase in calls to helplines coincides with the media campaigns that we're running nationally and locally, in that they will see a spike in calls after there's a sort of TV media campaign or something on social media. They're also telling us that they're getting more calls about the pressures that might be associated with lockdown measures, so concerns about financial pressures to do with pressures at work or people losing their jobs, and concerns about the complexities of things like child access. A few interesting things that we've noticed here, so both with the national helplines and in policing, we've noticed a significant shift to people reporting things online, so away from calling on the telephone but using online services. And some of the really positive things we've seen is the work that charities have done to produce tools that victims can use online, so things like tools for both victims about how they might keep themselves safe, tools and guidance for families who might keep friends and neighbours and others that they suspect might be suffering domestic abuse safe, but also tools for perpetrators and lots of encouragement for perpetrators to seek help. So one interesting thing we've seen is that Respect, a national charity who support perpetrators, have experienced quite a significant increase in calls for their services. A couple of concerns we have. So whilst we haven't seen a significant increase in calls to policing, and one of my challenges is that we have 43 different police forces across the UK who will collect their data slightly differently. So I don't have a kind of comprehensive data set, and we're doing things to collect it. But what I do know from forces anecdotally, they're telling me when I speak to them a couple of times each week that they are seeing an increase in what we would describe as non-crime incidents. So maybe matters that do coincide with the issues that helplines are receiving. We're obviously concerned that reporting of most serious violence or coercive controlling behaviour could be suppressed. And we're looking at what we can do to offer different ways for both victims to report, but also concerned family and friends who might be particularly concerned about the impact of lockdown. The other things that we're concerned about is that whilst we are working with the Crown Prosecution Service and the courts to maintain prosecutions, and although courts have closed, we are currently looking at how we can do remand hearings remotely using video links. So some of that's really, really positive and developing well. But we also know that some of the key services that can reduce incidents of abuse, like drug and alcohol treatment services or mental health services, those are under significant pressure. So we are aware from both helplines but also service users that there are some pressures there that might lead to increased abuse.
Thanks very much, Louisa. So following quite a similar trend, really. If I can come to Anthony, please, from an Australian point of view.
Thanks, Alex, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me online. As most people have already said, I think there's been obviously significant concern about the potential rise in family violence associated with the social distancing measures, significant job losses, and also increases in alcohol and mental health. So we've seen evidence of increases of drinking in the home and also calls to lines like Lifeline and other significant increases. But as the Assistant Commissioner Word said, there's been no significant increase in recorded domestic violence. I know New South Wales were the first to publish their data for March, showing no impact or no increase. And they suggested that since serious violence hadn't increased, that perhaps reporting, there hadn't been a change in reporting since that's less subject to discretionary reporting. A colleague and I have just released some data from Queensland showing similar no impact in assaults in March and no increases in breaches of domestic violence. But we also think it's possibly too early to conclude on the basis of March's data that there will be no impact. I think there's some really interesting data come out of the Google mobility trend data, which shows that a lot of the changes in movement don't really kick in until late March and well into April. And so obviously there's been a lot of concern about reporting as a consequence of that. And I know Queensland are moving to online reporting of domestic violence as they haven't already. They're certainly planning to move to online reporting to try and deal with that. But I think the important point to make, as others have said, is that many of our services have reported an increase in demand. So one of the New South Wales peak bodies have reported 50% of their service providers as having an increase in contact with victims, including for particularly complex cases. But that's not been universal. So some of our regional areas have not seen an increase, which has, again, raised some concerns about isolation. And then I think the other point which many have made is around helplines. We've seen initial drop in calls to helplines before a subsequent increase, but we've seen calls to the men's helpline for perpetrators see a fairly significant increase. So
thanks very much, Anthony. Interesting. Renee, can I come to you representing the States, please?
Yeah, hi. So America, we're always a little more difficult than the rest of the countries because we have 18,000 different police agencies. And we don't really have a good method of tracking statistics like in real time across the whole entire country. So a lot of the things that we have set up to track like domestic violence, child abuse are going to be after the fact once data comes in. So most of our stuff is like anecdotal, what you see from individual agencies. And we've seen some of the same things where reports are going down because the victims don't have access or they don't have ways to notify the police. One agency said they've seen like a 50% decrease in their child abuse cases, which is worrisome because, kids are not in school. They're not having the contact that they normally have with providers that could refer a case to the police. So that becomes a little worrisome when you see a large drop like that because it just doesn't disappear. That it's just not being reported. And we've seen, it was interesting, and I know that in the U.S., a lot of police agencies are trying to be creative about giving people opportunity to finding ways that people could report without having to necessarily call the police. And we've seen, and I'm not sure if it's an urban myth or something like that, but people are posting on Facebook now, like codes for women to use or somebody being abused, like saying, if you direct message me saying that you're looking for a mask, I don't sell masks, but if you ask me about selling masks, I'll know that you need help. And then I'll ask you what your address is to send you the mask, and I'll know to send the police there. So that is not something that's come from police departments. I think that's just a women supporting women kind of movement, but it's an interesting way of trying to think of ways to help victims notify the police that they need help. But like I said, in the US, right now we don't have any kind of like real-time tracking to watch data nationally. That's something that I know the Bureau of Justice Statistics is trying to create over the next year, so we could start tracking calls for service across the U.S. more in a real-time crime manner than we are right now. But so far, everything we have is just anecdotal, agency by agency.
Thanks, Renee. And I will no doubt come to Facebook a bit later when we look at initiatives. That's interesting. Dan, finally, is from Canada.
Yeah, thanks. Similarly to the US, we don't have an overarching organization that looks at crime statistics, but our Minister of Gender and Equality came out with reports in certain regions of 20 to 30% increase of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. We are seeing that there's places that are showing increases. The Greater Toronto area had a 22% increase, and there was actually reporting by one of the agencies about a 400% increase of calls for support. The other flip side of that becomes interesting is because our country is so large, we've got a lot of rural areas, and some of the rural areas are saying that it's eerily quiet. So there's concern that some of the individuals who may be experiencing violence in the rural areas don't have the ability to call out for help. So there's some concern about that, and there's certain organizations trying to determine how we're going to address the potential real silence that's unfortunately happened in the rural areas. One of the things that we are seeing in jurisdictions, including my own home agency, is not necessarily an increase in calls, but an increase in severity. So where we have a higher severity of offense where someone's become hurt significantly more than your common assault. So there's some concerns around that. There's definitely concerns around some of the places reporting a 20 to 30% increase in domestic violence, and a lot of our helplines have reported increased in calls, whether that's the kids helpline, the sexual assault helpline, and the domestic violence helpline. So it's not necessarily being reported to the police yet. Our concern is more of the wake after the fact, and when people are out of isolation, and we're going to be following that up with potential issues going on, this creating issues far into the future with increased adverse childhood experiences and different traumas as a result of isolation.
Thanks a lot, Dan. So potentially a slightly different picture emerging from the Canadian context, which is always interesting. We're going to move on to part two now, which is a great amount of thanks to the New Zealand Centre for Evidence-Based Policing to pull together an executive summary of all the current existing evidence around what works and what isn't effective around domestic violence. That's about a 50-page document, and all our discussants have read it, so thank you very much. This will be published with the podcast. It talks quite a lot about pulling levers potentially being effective, focusing on the power few and offering both deterrent and diversion. It talks quite a lot about suicide ideation and how that can be a predictor of significant harm in a domestic violence relationship. The power of cognitive behavioural therapy. It perhaps challenges some myths that there is around escalation in all cases. And it also talks around some examples of where arrest is used and where warnings are used, and the benefits or otherwise of both approaches. So I'd just be interested in your view of what you've read and what you think might be relevant or what you'd want to test back in your home area. So can I come to you first, Dean, from a Victoria point of view?
Thanks very much, Alex. Look, I think all the actual evidence and the actual documentation is interesting for all of us in some way, shape or form, and it has an impact on all parts of our policing response to family violence. I think it's about trying to pick out the key parts within all of that research and bundle it all up to try and improve everything that we do. For us, in terms of our environment, we would be sort of more leaning in terms of how we're structured at the moment, in terms of putting in a very much an investigative model in terms of the second stage of our policing response. So the frontline response does the initial report of family violence, and then we have an investigative response. So that's all gone in the last 2 years. So we've got 31 investigation units across the state, 230 detectives looking at what we would class as high-risk family violence incidents, and then putting in management plans around those particular incidents. So for us, the Australian Institute of Criminology, in terms of the report in relation to policing repeat domestic violence, sits very comfortably in that model. So we need to look at how our model is and what that looks like over time. And that also then flows into the Cambridge Centre of Evidence-Based Policing report in relation to targeting family violence, based around what we've seen in West Australia around the felonious few and the miscreant many. So, but all of those other aspects, the suicide's very high in relation to what we report on and gather, part of our frontline response to family violence and the impact that has on high risk, high harm, and those high risk indicators of significant harm into the future of a relationship around family violence. So every aspect is worth looking at. It's about where you can devote your best energies to get the best outcome in the shortest period of time.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Dean. Looking forward to how that develops in Victoria. I thought it was quite interesting how it highlighted how so much serious harm comes to our attention when it's never come to attention before. So it didn't start low risk and escalate to high risk, how 50% of homicides in some parts of the UK, for example, from a domestic point of view, had no previous records to the police. So quite a lot of assumptions have been challenged with the evidence. Natasha, from a New Zealand context, what do you think of the key implications you take away from the evidence for New Zealand?
I was really pleased when I read the executive summary and some of the articles to see that some of the initiatives that we've got underway in New Zealand actually cover off a lot of the key points. For example, information sharing. We have 2 integrated safety response pilots that government have funded, and a big part of that is mandate for government agencies and NGO representation to come in and share information. I think opportunities for us are looking at outcomes of interventions and how we measure them. We've had some evaluations completed for 2 of our whanaia pilot sites. So just so you know, New Zealand Police has 12 policing districts. At the moment, we have about 8 of those districts have the new developed response for whanaia within those districts. So we are looking at evaluating them as we go through, but I think that's key. What we've also done in the last week, we proposed that a national tasking and coordination that, based on the evidence put forward in this document, we might we're looking to use the New Zealand Crime Harm Index to take a deeper dive into the data that we hold on both reported offence and non-reported incidents of family harm. So that's Simon and his team are going to start looking at. Suicide, that's the other thing that I think we don't really dive very deep into that, aligned with family harm. So that's something that I'd like to see us have a look at as well. But yeah, I thought it was a well put together document, and it was pleasing for me to see that we're doing some of the things that are in there.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, we'd be interested to see how that develops as well. Louisa, I think you're familiar with a lot of the evidence. The main considerations for you and anything you'd like to see tested from an England and Wales point of view?
Yes, certainly, Alex. I think a few things for me. I was particularly interested in the comments on use of conditional cautions and multi-agency interventions reducing reoffending, because certainly that resonates with a lot of the effective perpetrator programs policing's been involved with here, and certainly something I've been talking with CPS, because one of the challenges of COVID-19 is that many of the agencies who might provide those diversionary or support activities with perpetrators are having to operate differently. So we're currently looking at what could be done. Really interested in the suicidal ideation work. I think what was really interesting for me in that, and particularly connecting it with that not every offender follows a path of escalation. So I think that certainly resonates from our work around domestic homicides and the domestic homicide review process here. What our strong view would be is that most of those contain an element of very controlling behaviour, and often that controlling behaviour limits interaction with other agencies, and it's at the point that victims try to leave that relationship or break free from that control that things happen very quickly. And certainly, I mean, the question about has your partner ever threatened or attempted suicide is a key part of our current risk assessments here, and also a key part of the work that we've been doing in multi-agency threat assessment conferences, where we look at the threat that perpetrators pose, but also some of the really effective programs for perpetrator management. So I think a few things I took away from that, probably, I mean, very interesting. I think some of the research about arrest leading to more harm is a little bit contentious, but I certainly agree that actually, and I suppose one of my challenges here is that I often am faced with a sort of suggestion or a pressure that policing provides the solution to family harm and domestic abuse, and I've got a very strong view that we've got a part to play, and prosecution is certainly part of a solution, but a public health approach and a multi-agency focus is really essential, and certainly all the evidence around perpetrator management and reducing the harm that perpetrators present would bear that out, because we know that addressing their multiple vulnerabilities is often the most effective way of reducing that reoffending. So I thought a lot was really interesting. There are some things we could take away short term to look at how that applies right now, but also an awful lot that's really relevant for us longer term too.
Great, thanks Louisa. And I think when you started you were referring to a diversion scheme that was initially tested in Hampshire in England. It was called CARA, where people were diverted at point of charge using a randomised control trial, and it seemed to show a statistically significant reduction in reoffending, and with qualitative evidence as well from the victims it seemed to show benefit, and they were diverted to CBT, form of CBT. So that's interesting. Thank you, Louisa. Coming to you then, Anthony, from Australia.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So, obviously we as a research organisation, even before COVID-19, we've been looking closely at family and domestic violence and trying to build an evidence base to help inform the Commonwealth's response to the problem. And this work that's been presented in the document that's been shared has actually been already had a significant influence over our thinking and the advice we've been putting forward. So we've drawn heavily on a lot of the work that's come out of the UK, US, and obviously Australia, New Zealand as well. So it's been already, I think, for us very useful. So we now have together our own research, some pretty compelling evidence about concentration, about short-term risk, about increases in repeat offending over time, and some of the information that can really help inform targeted responses. So we continue to communicate the message that the evidence shows that responses to domestic violence need to be timely, they need to be targeted, and they need to be graduated. So increasing intensity as the risk of harm to the victim increases. So that's the simple message we try and communicate, and obviously any responses that are implemented, we would like to see follow that kind of approach. Which of course leads us to focus deterrence, which with our material in the document is the approach that we've argued should be trialled here in Australia. And we've been speaking with David Kennedy and his team in the US about what that might look like and how it might work. So it's pleasing to hear other panellists talk about their approach as being consistent with that model. I think the other point, as others have mentioned, is around the suicide ideation work. We've just started a project at the moment looking at pathways to intimate partner homicide here in Australia. And I think that work will be extremely influential in our thinking around understanding those pathways and looking for intervention points based on a national body of evidence around domestic homicide. So I think we'll find that we'll draw on that work as well.
Thanks, Anthony. And it's really interesting you mentioning David Kennedy's work, which is obviously famous for sort of public place violence related to gangs and people being brought in and surrounded by their families and offered both sticks and carrots in a really intensive fashion. Not really tested or early evidence suggesting from a domestic violence cohort, is it effective or not? Early indications that it is, but it's interesting how many forces around the world have focused deterrence on gang violence, not so much on domestic violence, and that might be a message to all of us to consider when you look at the harm, that perhaps we should test that much more rigorously. But great stuff. Thank you. Renee, from the States, please.
So one of the things that I think is the most important, and I don't know how the other countries are going to fare after the COVID fallout, but what we're seeing is cities are starting to talk about budget cuts already and having conversations with their police departments about what that might look like in the near future. So to me, I think some of the power few, not only in domestic violence, but in all aspects of policing, that we're going to probably have to use some of the evidence that shows where to best put our resources. Because I think in the next 6 months to a year, we might see, especially smaller police agencies in the U.S., have their police resources cut. And the first group that usually goes in the U.S. are like our civilian resources. So any type of outreach units or analysts that we have usually get cut. And so I was thinking when it comes to the evidence and family harm and, like I said, really any topic within policing, that we really have to look at the evidence and what the research shows and apply it in a way that we're getting the best bang for our buck. Because I think we're going to be back like we were in 2008 and 9, with seeing police get cut from departments, and we are going to have to figure out how to be still effective and efficient in reducing crime and reducing community harm using different methods. So I think for me, what I see is I'd really like to see that pulled into police departments in the US to really apply that across the board.
Thanks, Renee. And you've hit on what can be the heart of evidence-based policing, I think, really. And the Treasury here have got a phrase. They want to know inputs. They want to know their resources, how much, inputs, outputs, outcomes. And the only way you can work the equation of resources, inputs, outputs, outcomes is by having an evidence-based approach. And so, as you know, the UK has gone through a significant austerity as well. We thought we were coming out of it, but you've rightly highlighted the COVID challenge. And if anything, we're going to need to be more evidence-based, which is what you were saying around, if we're going to spend money, how do we spend it where we know what the outcome is going to be, or can we test it effectively? And the power of few is one of the obvious ways to do that. So thanks for highlighting that point. It is a significant risk. Dan, can I come to you from Edmonton, Canada?
Yeah, you bet. One of the things that I think Canada is a little bit behind on is looking at harm. We have the Crime Severity Index. We've had the Crime Severity Index just about as long as the Cambridge Crime Harm Index has been out. But we don't necessarily use it as a tool to address our individuals. So oftentimes you'll have a low harm, high frequency domestic violence perpetrator becomes the focus, where a high harm, not as often frequency, we don't focus on as much. So I think from a national perspective, and specifically municipalities and rurally, we need to make sure we're focusing on the right people, and I think we need to do that by way of harm indexing. The felonious few, as Professor Sherman now calls them, we need to identify them. The focus of the deterrence piece, I think, has a lot of interesting, and it's interesting that we're talking about David Kennedy's work and from a gang perspective, and we haven't really pushed it to the domestic violence or intimate partner violence realm. But I think that's one of the things we need to do specifically in this realm, is not just focus on people that have called today, but identify our power few, our high harm offenders, and start going and doing that focused deterrence with them, and try to do that almost a preventative method. And I think that's when I'm going through all the literature on that, to me that is one of the kind of a key nugget when we're in the middle of isolation, is to ensure that we identify who we need to go at and then how. And I think that's the part that sometimes gets lost on policing with focused deterrence, is the how. Because what happens is we go, we're going to go do focused deterrence, and we become breach and rearrest teams, not actually focused deterrence teams. And I think we need to get our police agencies understanding what to do in those circumstances, what the script looks like, and how that conversation goes. Because I know even in our own organization in Edmonton, we started doing some offender management with focused deterrence. And I actually had a very senior police officer tell me, after they were developing relationships with some fairly high harm offenders, this is the first time in my entire career I felt like I've done something. When you start to get those kind of people would think be hard to reach people from an evidence-based perspective, and they start to see the magic that evidence-based brings to policing if we do it right, not do it the way we always done it after the researchers leave. I think there could be some very, very good benefits to policing that come out of the COVID crisis. If we got to look at the glass half full, let's look at doing some evidence-based practices like harm and focused deterrence in places that we hadn't done it before, and hopefully we see some positive changes going forward.
Thanks, Dan. That's really interesting. I've heard the saying about why police forces don't adopt ideas off other police forces is always one of three reasons, and all police officers have heard these three reasons. When I hear what you're doing, I either say, we do that already, or I say, we did it and it didn't work, or I say, no, it's different here. And we've already seen the similarities across the world, but if someone comes on my patch and tells me they've got a great idea, those are the normal three responses people get, and we need to probably move away from that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section now and merge the next two questions. So I'd like each speaker to sort of reflect on what they've heard so far, and perhaps pick out one main takeaway or comment on what other people have said, the other discussants. And then I'd also like you to perhaps offer some of your insight in relation to both the challenges and the opportunities that evidence-based policing offers to the investigation of family harm and domestic violence, because it's not easy. And, Louisa's already highlighted some of the issues and challenges with the Sherman and Harris research, for example, that showed differences between warning and arrests, and how you make policy implications out of that, or how you take it further. So I'd be fascinated to hear around, firstly then, your comment on some of the other discussants, and then secondly, the challenges and opportunities that evidence-based policing can offer to assist our policing of domestic violence and family harm. going to go back to you, Dean, first, please, from Victoria.
Thanks very much, Alex. I think probably in terms of the discussion, if you listen to the thread, particularly the last bit about budget implications and long-term issues, it's actually now we need to invest, not actually reduce our investment, sadly. What this process will have done, and one thing we haven't really touched on, I think it was touched on a little bit earlier, but is the impact for children. So what we know is that children are, I'll use the term very loosely, secondary victims of family violence, and probably in many respects not actually directly identifying or seeing the behaviours of parents or those in the family violence context. Now we've actually put them in 24/7 environments where those behaviours will be very, very obvious to them, and the downstream impact in terms of their development, the impact in terms of how they're going to relate to other people beyond now is going to be the thing that we need to actually, from an evidence base, try and track through, because they are our high harm, high impact offenders and high risk offenders into the future, and we don't track that well. We're dealing with what we see now because that's convenient and we know what we know. It's that classic we know what we know. We can deal with our high risk offenders and we can put things around them, but it's actually the children are going to be the people we need to thread through and identify from an evidence base about what does that going to look like for policing in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time, and that's not what we do well. That's where we need to be investing our money in my opinion, because we've got the system to actually deal with what we know. It's actually about that longer term stuff that we need to invest in. And that's where evidence and research comes into play for me. I think the other thing is for all of us is about what is the trigger point where the explosion of family violence reporting, family violence crime, and the impact on the whole system response is going to actually emerge. We're all in various stages of restrictions. We don't know when that's going to change. In Australia, it's very much business as usual for us in terms of reporting and responding. No significant change. The other thing about the research is, what if the change doesn't come? What does that actually mean in terms of how victims have actually endured the last period of time, and how is that going to play out in terms of future reporting? And we haven't turned our mind to that actually it might not actually increase. And so what is going on then prevents people from actually reporting, which I think then leads into the how do we align our research, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, Anthony, from an Australian perspective is, and New Zealand in particular, about natural disaster. So we're in a natural disaster, and the learnings from natural disasters flow into this about why people don't report. The issue is because they're so desperately trying to grapple with what they're dealing with in terms of, lack of housing, accommodation, no jobs, no security, where do I get my next meal, where do we live, that they actually disassociate themselves with actually what's going on in the abuse that they're actually enduring. And then what happens is they normalise that behaviour that, my partner's abusing me, but that's because of the stresses we're facing in a natural disaster outcome. So our policing research needs to start thinking about, this is a natural disaster, and what do we learn from that, and how do we pick up on those for the future, because this will occur again at a point in time. So I think there's an awful lot that research can do to help us plan and actually help us not only let's look back on what did we learn, but also actually why aren't we doing research now that takes us into that next generation of perpetrators of family violence, but also victims in terms of the way they have behaved, engaged, not engaged, as the case may be. I think that's a significant gap for us.
Thanks, Dean. You raised some really interesting points, and children, absolutely, adverse childhood experiences we're quite familiar with, but the policing response to that and to being a victim as a child of domestic abuse and seeing it happen is always quite complex, and for our staff not entirely clear. And then the other point I just raised is, if we haven't seen domestic violence go up, or sometimes we've seen it go down, apart from in Canada, is that because what we think is an absence of reporting because of all sorts of pressures, or is it actually because domestic violence has gone down because we've taken away pubs, we've taken away sporting events, we've taken away a number of other issues? In actual fact, are people moderating their behaviour in a way we can learn from? But we don't know yet, but hopefully as we do more research coming out of this, we'll try and understand that better. But thanks very much, Dean. Can I come to you, Natasha, then, from New Zealand?
Yeah, thanks. Interesting on your point that you just made around the question, is it dropping off? I spoke to one of our integrated safety response pilot sites. They've had it reported from some of their women's refuge sites that when talking to some of their high-risk victims, life's actually got better for them, which is quite fascinating because money's not being spent so much on alcohol. They're staying at home, they're helping with the children. They've come together as a family unit. So I thought that was quite fascinating, and that was coming from our Women's Refuge, and it was our high risk, so they've been connecting with some of their high risk victims, and that's some of the feedback they've had. So I think it would be really, I know I'm jumping the gun, but opportunities to delve deeper into that post-COVID to see, what that did look like. I think from the conversations that have happened, picking up on the multi-agency response, we have some good evaluations done on that, and which I'd be happy to share, in particular our pilot sites. And we've just seen that has, the districts that we've got that working in, it has made a difference, especially with our sector. So we've got collaborations. Government have funded services so that they are well funded to engage. We have perpetrators focused engagement and victim focused. So, I think that's been for us, we've still got a long way to go, don't get me wrong, but I think that's been key. Around the children, that is a big concern. Prior to COVID response, we were already looking at children's services for those who are exposed to family harm, and we've got a piece of work underway at the moment that is working through identifying the gaps, the barriers to children who are exposed, getting the help they need. So that's a piece of work currently underway, but I think you're absolutely right. There's real concern for these kids because they probably have nowhere to go. It'll be interesting to see the piece of work that comes out of this, and then perhaps the research opportunities for us there post-COVID is going back and looking at the impact on those children. The conditional cautioning, I'm really interested to find out some more information about that. That's something that in the family harm space we haven't been allowed to do pre-charge warnings so that's something that in New Zealand we haven't done. And the other thing, also your online reporting. We had a discussion in a task and coordination meeting last week at different ways of opening up for victims of family violence to report. There is nervousness across the country within the sector around that, so I'd be really interested to hear some more. We do have a multi-agency IT solution called the Family Safety System that is being used in our pilot site and also some of our whangaia sites. The data we can pull from that is fantastic, and it is fed straight into our frontline officers attending a family harm episode and entering the information in their family harm app on their phones. That is fed straight in. The reporting from that is key, but what we have seen over the last few weeks is a real issue around us reporting and pulling data together, because government has been extremely interested in the family sexual violence sector, and it's been a challenge as to where we get that consistent data. So I think going forward that's a huge opportunity for us to multi-agency platforms so that we are collecting data not just from police but for other agencies who hold a lot of information for families and whānau that don't come to police attention.
No, that's useful. And the point you make about reporting is a real evidence opportunity, because convention says orthodoxy in policing, the best common sense, that they need an officer and it needs to be face-to-face. I think we need perhaps to test that, because I've seen some emerging evidence that people can be more open if it's not face-to-face, if it's on a video conference or it's on a telephone call in actual fact. But we just don't know, and we want the best evidence, and we want people to feel free to do it. But I think it's incumbent on us in policing to try and see what the case is, and COVID would be a great opportunity for that, although time is passing. So thanks, Natasha. Louisa, some challenges and opportunities and comments on what you've heard?
Thanks, Alec. Really struck by the similarities that we're all facing, particularly the challenges with data and just having an accurate picture of what's going on. Although reassured that if Renee can solve a challenge of 18,000 organisations, then 43 here should be a breeze. Natasha's comment as well about higher risk victims, that really resonated for me, and that certainly before COVID-19, a lot of our NGOs would tell us that often victims are the best at managing the risk that they're facing, and particularly in situations that are quite stable. So where there aren't lots of external variables affecting things day to day, and some of the lockdown measures could actually create a relatively stable environment, but that does mean we might be really concerned about when measures are lifted, whether we will then see an increase in abuse, particularly for those in the most sort of highest risk relationships. The involvement of NGOs with strong government support and funding being beneficial would really resonate from what Natasha said. And I mean, certainly for us here, we know that where we have that support and where there are perpetrator programs like the DRIVE programme that's been evaluated by Professor Marion Hester, they can be really effective, but they are incredibly expensive and resource intensive, and they do involve addressing all the multiple vulnerabilities of both victim and perpetrator. Dan, in Canada, your comment about using principles of integrated offender management for focused deterrence really struck me. This week with the College of Policing, in fact today, we've issued some new best practice guidance on the management of dangerous and serial perpetrators in domestic abuse, which I'm really hoping to encourage police forces to adopt nationally. There's some good work in there that's been trialled by a number of forces and subject to some robust evaluation, so some really, really good things in there. And then I suppose in terms of evidence-based policing, I've been involved in this work for about 6 years now, but 29 years in policing. And I think the one thing, sometimes I think we strive for sort of perfect tools in domestic abuse, whether it's a risk assessment tool or a guide for officers. And I'd always say, actually, I'd rather have something that fits the sort of and acknowledges the often generic nature of policing for our first responders and works with their skills that they have, rather than being really dependent on officers having a really high level of understanding and specialist knowledge when it comes to domestic abuse. Now, we do have officers with those specialist skills and that knowledge, but they're not our first responders, and often we need tools that will work for those first responders, that will be more intuitive, more user-friendly, and will guide them. And there's been some great developments of late in developing new tools that identify and have been proven to identify coercive controlling behaviour and higher risk. So I'm really hopeful about that. But I suppose my plea about evidence-based policing is please make it work for policing. And sometimes I think there's a bit of sort of reconciling there to make that happen. But thank you.
Thanks, Louisa. Two good points there. So the guidance that you've spoken about from the College of Policing, is that on open source on the website?
It's been approved today. It's gone out to chief constables on our briefing note with the COVID response work. And so in the coming days, it will be published by the college as well.
Thanks. And just for colleagues on the podcast and watching it, there are a number of resources you can access evidence about domestic abuse. The College of Policing has an open source What Works Centre where you can see what's been assumed as effective and otherwise. There is also the Campbell collaboration where they've done some big systematic reviews on domestic abuse. There's the Global Policing Database, run by Queensland University in Australia. And there's the Evidence-Based Policing Matrix by Cynthia Lum, housed in the States. All of these things are assets that bring together the current latest evidence around domestic abuse. I was really struck, Louisa, by your point around designing it for what policing is and not striving for perfection, using a behavioural approach. It is a lens, and I should take that away. That's a lens through which we should see evidence-based practice. You know, if we've got a machine learning algorithm that will predict A and B and C, well, that's fine, but what does that mean for a frontline officer, and how can he or she get it, and then how can he or she interpret the data in a way that is really easy to understand? So thanks for that. If I can move on to Anthony then from Australia.
Sure, thanks Alex. I think it's clear, obviously there's some consistent trends clearly emerging, but I think it's true to say that we probably don't have a truly clear picture on what's happening, and I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens as some of the data from April in particular, in Australia at least, when some of the measures were most stringent. I think that'll be incredibly interesting. But I think the lessons for me around importance of sharing data, I think a lot of the public debate around what's happening, I think we're looking at different data sources as competing evidence rather than trying to understand what they might mean together as kind of when drawing together, you know, kind of the helpline evidence, the service sector evidence and the policing evidence around patterns of violence. And similarly, I think when we talk about targeting high-risk offenders, one of the challenges is always meeting community expectations and expectations from the sector around a universal response to family violence perpetrators. If I can touch on just Dean's comments about the natural disasters, I absolutely think that's a really valuable source of evidence for what potentially we might see. I think we know from that research that it can take, as Dean said, some time to see increases in reporting of family violence. You know, there's a lot going on in people's lives that they're trying to manage with significant financial stress at the moment, particularly, and other things. So we do need to be prepared for a possible increase in reporting, but we can't guarantee that that's obviously going to happen. So we need to be keeping a close watch on that. But I think the other thing that's really important from the natural disaster research is it shows that the impact is not experienced equally. Those communities that experience greater loss due to the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria, for example, will experience much higher rates of family violence. So while we might not see aggregate changes, some communities might be hurting a lot more than others. So I think that's a really important point. I think, though, and just to kind of wrap up my comments, I think we should acknowledge that family harm is one of those areas in policing, probably more so than many other areas, which is extremely progressive. We've seen significant reforms already in how police respond. And, in the case of Victoria, I think Victoria is really leading the country and possibly a world leader in reforming the response to family violence so that it's consistent with the evidence. And I don't just say that because Dean's on the panel and Dave's the president. But, we have seen significant changes already. And I think we're at the point where we're looking to refine rather than reinvent the response to family violence. And I think what's happening now with COVID gives an opportunity to look at how we might refine that response, and evidence-based policing really does give those tools to help see what we can do to improve without necessarily completely changing the response to how we police family and domestic violence.
Thanks, Anthony. Some interesting points there, particularly around how different communities during COVID will experience domestic abuse and family harm differently. We haven't heard any of that this evening yet, probably because we don't know yet, and that will emerge as the data comes along, but really interesting. Thanks. Renee, from the States.
So one of the things that I wanted to say, and it's kind of, instead of going through like each of the different practices, is I think it's important that if people are going to take the handout that we made and try to apply some of these things in their organization, to understand, and I think you said it, Alex, that this isn't easy. Like, I think sometimes people in policing think, okay, with evidence-based practices, I could just pull something off the shelf, apply it out in the field, and then if it doesn't work, like just chuck the whole thing. To me, it's an iterative process to really start learning about what works and what doesn't work in your own agency. So one of my favorite articles by Larry Sherman is the targeting, testing, tracking, is that if you're going to apply some of these things into the field, is to test it out. And don't think that when you're applying an evidence-based practice in the field that it's going to work perfectly. You have to start tweaking it to understand like your community, your police agency, how it's being developed or how it's being implemented in the field. So to me, it's more of like an overall message that as this series comes out covering, different topics from week to week, that you get a basic understanding of evidence-based practices is really taking what we know about what works and what doesn't work, and then applying it in the field and testing it to see if it works in your organization. So to me, like here, what we've all kind of discussed, I think this area of research has a very good evidence base for us to apply, and don't get discouraged either when you try applying it in the field.
Thanks, Renee. Wise words. And I'd echo your comment around that article. It's called the Triple T. If anybody wants an introduction to evidence-based policing who's watching this podcast, just have a read of that. It really summarizes it well. And the tracking piece you mentioned is really important. So we have bright ideas and we even turn them into policy sometimes, and then our staff don't do it and we don't do it because we don't have a mechanism for understanding what our staff are really actually doing. And that's across the whole of policing and across the whole of society. It's perhaps the T that is sometimes massively undergunned, which probably should be amplified. Thanks, Renee. And Dan, finally, from a Canadian point of view, before we wrap up.
Yeah, no, I think this has been a great discussion and a couple of great points. And one of the points talking about adverse childhood experiences and the evidence we know that potentially these people become, not everyone who experiences adverse childhood experiences gets arrested, but a lot of people who are incarcerated currently have high ACEs scores. But I think this is an opportunity for us to, as organizations, move towards a trauma-informed approach and actually really do that, where we can actually maybe stop some of these individuals who are experiencing ACEs as a result of this disaster from getting down that road. And I think that's something we need to get our police agencies. I know Wales is leading the charge on that a lot with the public health relationships there. And again, one other thing, just Renee made me think of this, having the ability to explain to our police partners that there is scientific uncertainty in all science, and evidence-based practices in policing are no different. Just because something works really well somewhere, it doesn't mean it's going to work, but we need to, and then the problem with policing is we go, well, see, this evidence-based policing stuff doesn't work. We have to explain scientific uncertainty to police and go, hey, this isn't easy, but it's better than what you're doing, because what we've done is we've impacted and we've shown, if we target and test and track things properly, that our outcomes are better than they were in the past. Our outputs might look a little bit different, and that's okay. And I think this is the thing about COVID, is it slowed some things down, and I think it's highlighted some things, and it's going to give us an opportunity to explain scientific uncertainty, look at evidence-based practices, and look at evidence-based practices through a trauma-informed lens. And I think if we do that, the magic additional magic that comes out of that is we actually increase our police legitimacy. And if we increase our police legitimacy, we might see higher levels of reporting, but we also might see lower levels later on in life of issues around trauma and traumatic events.
Thanks, Dan. And anyone watching this should read into trauma-informed and public health approach from Wales. Again, they're words that are easy to trip off the tongue, but actually picking up Louisa's point, how we interpret those as a frontline officer is really important, and how we turn that into policy from a policing point of view is really important. Folks, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting discussion, a lot of thought leadership, and I hope the people watching this will go away, read the document when it's published, and think around how you can translate some of those findings back into the workplace to improve outcomes for people suffering from family harm. I'd like in particular to thank the New Zealand Centre for Evidence-Based Policing for facilitating this and pulling together the document. Steph, your team from KPMG in Victoria, really grateful for you setting it up and supporting us. And most importantly, for the discussants, I'm really grateful, ranging from 5 a.m. through to 9 o'clock in the evening, to Dean from Victoria, to Natasha from New Zealand, from Louisa from the UK, West Midlands, Anthony from Australia, Renee from the States, and Dan from Edmonton, Canada. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been watching the first and inaugural global collaboration for the Societies of Evidence-Based Policing, looking at domestic violence during COVID. Stay safe out there, and thank you very much for your time.